Listen closely, and you can almost hear how ordinary that afternoon began. New York, 1911, Greenwich Village, late March lights spilling down the streets with a gentle confidence, as if winter had finally loosened its grip. It was a Saturday, the kind of day that invites small comforts, a longer walk, a slower lunch, a glance into shop windows. The city sounded busy in the familiar way, wagon wheels, footsteps, a stray laugh, a vendor calling out, the thin music of life moving forward without suspicion. And then one sound that didn't belong, a blunt impact, a heavy, unmistakable thud that stopped people mid-step, the way a wrong note can stop a pianist's hands in the air. For a single beat, there was silence, not peaceful silence, but the kind that happens when the human brain tries to name what it has just heard. Then a scream, sharp enough to cut through everything. The people on Washington Place looked up. They saw the Asch Building rising above them, 10 stories of modern promise, clean lines, a structure that had been advertised almost proudly as fireproof. From the street, it looked solid and respectable, the sort of building that reassures you, brick, stone, and the confidence of engineering. It was not the kind of place where disaster seemed possible. It was not a crumbling tenement. It was not a wooden shack. It was a modern factory building in a modern city, an argument against chaos. And yet, from high above, something fell. At first, their eyes did what eyes often do when reality is too cruel. They misinterpreted. They told themselves it was cloth, a bundle of fabric thrown from a window, a roll of material, heavy, careless, inconvenient, but not tragic. It was easy to believe, after all, it was a garment factory. Fabric belonged to the scene. The mind reached for the simplest explanation, the least painful one. Then another fell, and another. The street began to fill with that strange, stunned upward gaze, faces tilted to the sky, mouths half open, bodies frozen in the posture of disbelief. People pointed. Someone said a word you can't quite hear above the noise. Another person began to back away, as if distance could turn an impossible image back into something normal. More shapes dropped from the 9th floor. Some hit the sidewalk. Some hit the pavement with a sound no one forgets once they've heard it. The crowd flinched with each impact, as if the street itself were being struck. And still, for a few seconds longer than you would think possible, there remained confusion because the mind keeps bargaining with reality until reality refuses to negotiate. Then a detail appeared in midair that ended the bargaining forever. One of the falling bundles moved, not like fabric in wind, not like a sack tumbling. It moved with intention, with panic, with the frantic, heartbreaking instinct of a person trying to fix what cannot be fixed. Witnesses later would speak of it in the same stunned tone, a figure, falling, and still trying, almost politely, almost absurdly, to pull down a skirt, to preserve modesty in the last second of life, noted by strangers on the street below. That is when the crowd understood. Those were not rolls of cloth. Those were young women, girls, really, so many of them, not yet old enough to be fully hardened by the city. They were the ones you might pass on a sidewalk and not notice. Slim shoulders, tired eyes, hands that moved quickly because their wages depended on speed. They were the ones who carried the weight of families on small pay. They were the ones who learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut because that was how you survived in a factory. And now they were at the windows of the 9th floor, throwing themselves into the open air as if the sky were the only door left. The street erupted into motion. People ran forward and ran back at the same time. Some tried to get closer, driven by the human impulse to help even when help is impossible. Others staggered away, their bodies refusing to remain where the horror was landing. A policeman pushed through the crowd, shouting orders that sounded thin and useless against the scale of what was happening. Someone yelled for ladders. Someone yelled for water. Someone yelled for God. But the building kept answering with more falling bodies. Look up again, and you see the windows. Smoke begins to spill, dark, thick, hungry smoke that tells you something is burning with intensity. You can't yet see flame from the street, not clearly, but you can see the behavior of the air. It grows frantic, as if the building is exhaling poison. Behind the glass, shadows flicker. movement, arms, faces. Then the sudden disappearance of a figure as someone climbs onto the sill. There is a moment, just a moment, when each person at the window hesitates. A silhouette outlined against the light, a body deciding between two deaths. And then, with the speed of desperation, they jump. One after another, they fall. It is a rain, and it is not metaphorical. It is a rain of bodies that turns a sunny Saturday into a public funeral without warning. The city watches it happen in real time, unable to look away, unable to understand how such a modern building could become a slaughterhouse in minutes. Some men in the crowd try something instinctive and doomed. They spread a coat, a canvas, anything imagining they can catch what is falling. But a human body from 9 stories is not something you can catch like a child leaping into arms. The force is beyond kindness. It tears through hope like paper. A few attempts are made. Each attempt ends with the same brutal lesson. There is no gentle way to receive a life thrown from the sky. And still the figures keep appearing at the windows. The soundscape becomes a nightmare collage. Screams above, screams below. The clatter of feet, the shrill whistle of alarm. The rising roar of fire engines rushing in too late. And beneath it all, the recurring, sickening punctuation of impact. Each thud is a period at the end of a sentence that should never have been written. In those first minutes, most of the people on the street still don't know the name Triangle Shirtwaist. They don't know who owns the factory, who locked which doors, what rules were enforced inside. They don't know that the victims are mostly immigrant girls, Italian and Jewish, some only 14, 15, 16, their youth traded for a paycheck. They don't know the word greed yet, not in connection with this building. All they know is the sight of human beings falling from the sky because they are trapped. And the cruelest part of the hook, the part that makes the story lodge in the listener's chest, is the time. How quickly the world can become unrecognizable. This entire horror, this entire transformation from ordinary afternoon to legendary tragedy unfolds not over days, not over hours, but over minutes. 18 minutes, in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee, to write a letter, to walk a few blocks. New York is forced to witness something so violent and so public that it will never fully forget it. The street becomes a witness stand. The crowd becomes an unwilling jury. And above them, inside a building that promised safety, hundreds of lives are being negotiated by flame. To understand why bodies fell from the 9th floor, you have to stop looking up at the windows and start looking inward into the logic of the place. Because this wasn't a freak accident in a flimsy shack. This was a modern building in a modern city, and that is precisely what makes the story so unbearable. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire did not happen because New York lacked intelligence. It happened because New York had a system that valued profit more than people, and the building simply obeyed that system. The Asch Building stood on Washington Place like a promise made of stone. It had been promoted as fireproof, a word that sounds like salvation when you are an immigrant worker spending your days around cloth dust and oil. And in a narrow technical sense, the building did have an advantage. Its structure was solid masonry and concrete and steel that would not ignite like timber. But a fireproof skeleton does not guarantee a safe body. Because what burned wasn't the building itself. What burned was everything inside it. Cotton, paper patterns, wooden tables, machine oil, scraps of fabric that accumulated like dry leaves waiting for a spark. Inside, the factory floors were crowded with rows of sewing machines set so close together that movement became a kind of choreography. Young women sat shoulder to shoulder, heads bent, hands moving fast, faster, always faster. Their speed was measured and monetized. In that room, time was not abstract, it had a price per piece. The air held a fine dust from cloth, invisible until light cut through it at the right angle. If you've ever seen sunlight in an old room reveal floating particles, you know what I mean. A quiet snowfall of lint and fiber, and you realize you are breathing the residue of labor. The workers were overwhelmingly immigrant girls and young women, Italian and Jewish, many of them barely out of childhood. 14, 15, 16, 17, some older, but still young enough that their faces carried a softness the city had not yet erased. They were not people who had come to America for leisure. They came because families were hungry, because old countries had run out of mercy, because the new world promised wages even if the wages were small and the hours brutal. In many cases, these girls were not simply helping their families. They were supporting them, a father with irregular work, a mother at home with smaller children, a household that depended on the few dollars a week brought home in an envelope. The factory did not just take their time, it took their youth and turned it into survival. And above this workforce were two men with names that would become infamous, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, the owners, sometimes called the Shirtwaist Kings. Their product was a fashionable garment, a blouse that was modern for the era, worn by women who could afford to treat fashion as choice rather than necessity. The irony is bitter. Poor girls stitched clothing for a world far above their pay grade. Harris and Blank were not the only factory owners in New York, and that matters. If this were just about two uniquely evil men, you could put the blame in a neat box and walk away. But the Triangle Fire is horrifying because it reveals a pattern, the way an entire system can normalize cruelty until cruelty feels like policy. Their obsession, by many accounts, was theft, specifically the theft of cloth. Not bolts of fabric carried out dramatically, but small pieces, scraps, remnants, material that, to the owners, represented lost profit. In a garment factory, fabric is money. Every scrap feels like leakage. And when profit becomes a religion, the factory becomes a temple with locked doors. So they lock doors, not all doors, not in every sense, but enough to turn safety into a mirage. On certain floors, one of the stairwell doors was kept locked from the outside during working hours. The reason in the language of management was control, to prevent unauthorized breaks, to ensure workers left only through the designated exit, to facilitate bag checks so no one stole fabric. It is the kind of policy that might sound small when spoken in a calm office tone. We keep the door locked for security. But in a fire, a locked door is not a policy. It is a sentence. Think about what that means psychologically to the workers, even before the fire. They arrived each day and entered a place where they were watched. Their movement was controlled. Their dignity was negotiated. They were young women in a foreign land, inside a room run by men who did not trust them. A locked door is not just a physical barrier. It is a message: you are not fully human here. You are inventory. Now place this first-class prison inside the Asch Building's vertical reality. Triangle operated on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Those are heights that feel safe on a normal day: views, breezes, distance from street filth. But in an emergency, height is a trap unless the building's escape routes are designed for speed and volume. The Asch Building had stairs. It had elevators. It had what was called a fire escape, an external metal structure that looked reassuring from a distance. It had windows. These are the ingredients of safety, at least on paper. But safety is not about ingredients. It's about whether the recipe works under panic. The factory also had its own internal conditions that encouraged fire to spread quickly. Work tables were piled with materials. Bins collected scraps. Patterns hung or lay in stacks. Machines were powered and oiled. The environment was, in modern terms, a fuel-rich space. Cotton burns fast. It burns eagerly. And when cotton is present as loose scraps and fine dust, it becomes explosive in its speed. You don't need a great blaze to begin. You need only a small flame in the wrong place. All of this, the locked door, the crowded floor, the flammable waste, was not a surprise waiting to happen. It was a known risk treated as acceptable. That is what greed does. It turns unsafe into worth it. So when you return to the street scene, people staring up at falling bodies understand the larger betrayal. The building's reputation as fireproof was a marketing phrase, not a promise of escape. The owner's obsession with theft was a moral distortion that turned exits into checkpoints. The workers' youth and immigration status made them easy to control and easy to ignore. And the city's regulatory environment, fragmented, inconsistent, often influenced by business pressure, allowed this arrangement to exist. This is why the Triangle story is not simply about fire. Fire is a force of nature. This is about architecture and policy being used as instruments of power. It is about a workplace designed more like a funnel than a refuge. It is about a system that treated human beings as replaceable parts, until the parts began falling from the sky where everyone could see. The cruelest thing about a factory fire is how quickly it rewrites the rules of the room. One moment, the air is filled with the steady rhythm of labor, the soft clatter of sewing machines, the murmured conversations, the occasional laugh that slips out despite exhaustion. The next moment, the room is no longer a room. It is a trap with heat. It begins, as disasters so often do, with something small enough to dismiss until you can't. A cigarette butt, a match, a spark, something that falls into a container of fabric, scraps the way a drop of oil falls into a pan and quietly waits for flame. Cotton doesn't resist. Cotton invites. The scraps in the bin are not compact and heavy. They are loose, airy, eager to catch. Once fire touches that kind of fuel, it doesn't crawl. It leaps. At the 8th floor, the flame finds oxygen and turns into movement. It climbs through cloth and dust and paper patterns like a hungry animal discovering a pantry. Someone notices a curl of smoke, then a sudden orange flare. Then the room's temperature shifts in a way the body recognizes before the mind can explain. A worker stands, chair scraping back. Another looks up, blinking. Then someone yells a sound that changes every face at once, and the fire starts running. Fire in a factory doesn't behave like the tidy flame of a candle. It is fed by what the factory's made of: cloth, paper, oil, wood. It expands in directions that feel almost intelligent. It climbs upward because heat rises, and because in tall buildings, vertical pathways, shafts, stairwells, open spaces can act like chimneys. The Asch Building, fireproof in structure, becomes a tower that funnels heat. The fire is not impressed by concrete. It is delighted by everything human beings put inside concrete. Within minutes, the 8th floor is in chaos. People move not as individuals, but as currents pulled toward the idea of escape. There is a kind of frantic efficiency at first. Chairs overturned, feet moving fast, bodies trying to find the familiar routes. But panic doesn't start with screaming. Panic starts with acceleration. The room speeds up. The air thickens. Smoke begins to take away visibility and breath in the same quiet motion. Word travels upward. Someone runs for the stairs. Someone tries the phone. Someone shouts to warn the floors above. The 9th and 10th floors receive the first signals as a kind of rumor, something wrong below, smoke coming, maybe a fire, until the rumor becomes scent, and the scent becomes taste. Smoke has a bitter taste. It doesn't just enter the mouth, it sticks to the tongue like a warning you can't spit out. Then the 9th floor realizes the fire is not a distant problem. It is approaching, it is coming through the building like a verdict. Now the corridor of choices begins, and every choice carries its own cruelty. The first instinct is the stairwell. You run to the door that should lead down into safety. You grab the handle, you pull, nothing. Again, harder, nothing. The locked door does not announce itself with a villain's voice. It announces itself with silence and resistance. The kind of resistance that makes your heart punch against your ribs. People press behind you, shouting, pushing, begging you to open it. You can feel their breath on your neck, the collective weight of the living pressed into a narrow space. Someone screams, not from fire yet, but from the realization we are locked in. Hands pound the door. Nails scrape wood. Someone hits it with a tool. Someone tries the frame, but the lock is outside. The lock is a decision made hours earlier by men who are not in this hallway. The lock does not care that girls are crying. It does not care that smoke is arriving. It does not care that time is collapsing. So the crowd pivots, like water forced to change direction. They run for the other route. Elevators. 2 small elevator cars, ordinary on an ordinary day. A convenience for moving between floors, suddenly become lifeboats in a sinking ship. The elevator operator, Joseph Zito, does something both heroic and horrifying. He keeps coming. He brings the car up, opens the doors, and girls pour in. He takes them down. He returns, again. Each trip is a gamble with heat and smoke. Each return is a choice to face the burning upper floors one more time. The elevator shaft becomes a throat filled with smoke. The heat begins to warp things that shouldn't warp. Metal rails can bend under extreme temperature. Cables can lose their calm. The air inside the car becomes harder to breathe. And yet, Zito keeps making trips until the machinery can no longer obey. This is one of the most haunting details of the Triangle tragedy. The elevator could save some people, but it could not save everyone. And in a crowd, some feels like cruelty. Imagine the moment when the elevator doors open and 20 hands reach for it, and only a few bodies can fit. Someone is pulled in, someone is pushed out, someone falls, someone begs. The elevator closes, the car descends. Those left behind stare at the shrinking possibility, then turn to the next option with a kind of animal urgency, which brings them to the fire escape. And from the street, an external metal escape route sounds like safety. It suggests a ladder to the outside world. But the Triangle fire escape was not the kind you imagine today. Robust, overbuilt, designed for mass evacuation. It was a thin metal structure attached to a wall, already questionable, already cheap. It was a promise that had never been tested by hundreds of bodies moving at once. When the girls reach it, hope surges. They push through windows, climb onto the narrow metal platform, and begin descending. More follow, then more. The fire behind them is advancing, and the air around them is filling with smoke. Fear turns their hands into claws gripping railings. The structure begins to carry a weight it was never meant to carry, human weight multiplied by panic, a living load shifting unpredictably. Then it happens. The metal gives way, not slowly, not politely. It tears from the wall as if the building itself rejects the escape route. The platform breaks, and with it falls a cluster of bodies, around 20 people plunging into the narrow courtyard space below, a concrete chute that offers no forgiveness. The sound of the fall is not just impact. It is the sound of hope being broken in midair. Now the 9th floor is running out of options. Smoke thickens. Flame begins to claim edges of the room. The temperature rises into something that doesn't feel like weather, but like punishment. Hair can singe. Fabric can ignite. The air becomes so hot it is painful to inhale, so smoky that each breath feels like swallowing ash. And still, the stairwell door is locked. This is the core of the struggle. A room full of young women who have worked hard their whole lives, trapped not by accident, but by policy. The fire does not need to be clever. It only needs time. And time, in those 18 minutes, becomes a collapsing ceiling. Some girls try to fight the fire with whatever they can find, as if a bucket or a cloth could negotiate with an inferno. Others crowd at windows, pressing faces against glass, looking down at the street where people stare up. From above, the people below look like a distant, unreachable world, safe, breathing, alive. The distance is not just physical, it is social. It is the distance between those who have choices and those who do not. And now the story begins to tilt toward its most unbearable reality. When a person is trapped between fire and a sealed exit, the window stops being a view and becomes a door. At first, they hesitate, because jumping does not feel like escape. It feels like surrender. But the fire changes the definition of surrender. It forces you to understand that staying is not survival. Staying is being consumed. So they climb onto sills. They look down. They see the street far below. They see the crowd. They see the firemen arriving with ladders that are too short. They hear shouting that cannot reach them in time, and the minutes keep bleeding away. From the street, the fire looked like a problem you could solve with enough urgency. You could hear the engines before you could see them, iron wheels rattling, hooves striking stone, men shouting over one another as if volume could bend time. Firemen arrived with the confidence of routine, because in New York, alarms were common and courage was institutional. They carried ladders, they dragged hoses, they took positions with the sharp efficiency of men trained to run toward what others flee. But when they lifted their faces and truly saw the 9th floor, that confidence cracked into something quieter. Because the height was wrong, the building was wrong, the situation was wrong in the way a nightmare is wrong. You recognize the scene, but the tools you brought do not belong to it. The ladders, long, respectable, proud, rose upward and stopped far below where the girls were trapped. They reached toward the 6th floor, perhaps the 7th at best, and then surrendered to gravity. And above that, the windows of the 9th floor were alive with movement, silhouettes pressed against glass, hands waving, bodies leaning out, faces that were not asking for rescue so much as pleading for the world to make sense again. You can imagine the helplessness of the men below. They were firemen trained to save, and the geometry of the city had suddenly made saving impossible. They aimed water upward, but water is not a miracle when it arrives too late and cannot penetrate an inferno that has already claimed the room. The hose streams arced beautifully in the air and then broke into mist before they could reach the heart of the fire. It looked like effort, it looked like action, but it did not look like salvation. And the crowd on the street, hundreds, then thousands, watched the same realization spread through the faces of the firemen. The girls above were out of reach. The windows began to change from scenes of panic to scenes of decision. At first, people clung to the frame of hope. They believed, irrationally, that the next moment would bring a taller ladder, a clever maneuver, a sudden opening of a locked door. The human mind is stubborn in its refusal to accept the finality of a trap. Even in smoke, even with flames licking closer, the mind bargains. Someone will come, someone will fix it, there will be time. But time in a fire does not behave like time in ordinary life. It compresses, it tightens. Each breath becomes more expensive. Heat makes the air feel thick and hostile, as if the room is turning against the lungs. Smoke dims the world until even familiar faces become half-recognizable shadows. In that altered atmosphere, the future shrinks to seconds. At the 9th floor windows, you could see the moment when bargaining ends. A girl climbs onto the sill. She is not dramatic. She is not performing. She is simply trying to put distance between her body and the wall of heat behind her. Her posture tells the truth. She leans outward, not because she wants the sky, but because she can no longer stay inside. Another appears beside her, then another. They look down and recoil not from the sight of the street, but from the realization of height. They cling to the frame as if the building itself could still choose to forgive them. Below, firemen spread nets. In theory, the nets were a last defense, a way to catch falling bodies the way you catch a person leaping from a low window. But physics has no empathy. A fall from the 9th floor carries a force that turns well-meant fabric into an illusion. The first bodies that hit the nets struck with such violence that the nets tore, snapped, collapsed, proved instantly that good intentions cannot substitute for engineering. The crowd saw it happen and made a sound that was half gasp, half grief. Even the act of trying to rescue became another form of witnessing failure. And now the leap becomes not a choice between living and dying, but a choice between two kinds of death, one immediate, one unbearable. Fire does not merely kill. It terrorizes, it consumes air. It turns escape routes into corridors of heat. It makes the skin feel as if it is being punished for existing. In that space, at that moment, the girls were not jumping the way a healthy person jumps into water for sport. They were stepping away from a fate that felt worse than impact. They were refusing to be taken slowly. You can tell the story without sensationalizing it, simply by holding on to the human details that reveal the tragedy's true scale. Some girls screamed, some did not. Some prayed, some called names, some held their hair back as if the world still cared about neatness. Some tried to help others. Even then, pulling a friend toward a window, sharing the last inches of space on a sill. And yes, witnesses spoke of two young women who leaned close, kissed goodbye, held hands, and went together not as a spectacle, but as a final act of solidarity in a world that had stripped them of every other kind of dignity. That detail matters because it tells you what greed could not fully destroy. The factory could lock doors, but it could not lock out the human instinct to love. The bodies fell, one after another, and the street below became a terrible ledger, each impact another entry written into the city's memory. People in the crowd turned away and still heard it. Others stared and later could not explain why. Some tried to rush forward, then stopped, because there was nothing to do but witness. In that moment, New York learned what it means to be modern and powerless at the same time. Inside the building, the fire completed its work with frightening speed. The room that had been filled with the orderly noise of sewing became a furnace. The stairwell door that had been locked for security became a final wall. The fire escape that had been installed as a symbol of compliance became a collapsing trap. The elevators that had made heroic trips became unusable. Every layer of the factory's daily discipline, its crowding, its control, its obsession with preventing theft, revealed itself as a design for disaster. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, it ended. Not because the danger passed, but because there were fewer people left to endanger. In under 20 minutes, 146 people were dead. A number so large it becomes abstract unless you force yourself to translate it into faces, families, breakfasts left uneaten, coats still hanging at home, younger siblings waiting for a paycheck that would never arrive. The city's ordinary Saturday was over. It had become a mass funeral with no warning and no consent. If you slow your voice here, if you let silence carry weight, you can land the most damning truth. These deaths were not the inevitable price of industry. They were the result of decisions. A locked door, a neglected fire escape, a workplace arranged for output rather than escape, a culture that accepted that young immigrant girls could be placed at risk because they did not have the power to refuse. And now, in the ash that settled over Greenwich Village, a different fire began, one that burned not in cloth bins but in conscience. Because the city had seen the bodies fall, it could not pretend it was rumor. It was visible, public, undeniable. When the fire went out, the city was left with a new kind of smoke, one that didn't rise into the sky, but settled into the conscience. The Asch Building still stood. Its concrete frame, the proud fireproof skeleton, remained stubbornly intact, as if the structure itself wanted to argue that it had done nothing wrong. And that image, the building standing while the people inside it were gone, became the perfect symbol of what came next. A system built to endure, even when human beings are treated as disposable. In the days after, grief moved through immigrant neighborhoods like a slow winter. Funerals multiplied. Mothers searched for daughters who did not come home. Fathers who had once believed in the promise of work stared at the brutal mathematics of it. A factory could take your child, and the city could still call it business. Names appeared in papers, faces appeared in photographs. For many New Yorkers, this was the first time the garment industry's hidden reality entered the public eye. Not as a rumor, not as a complaint from labor activists, but as bodies and funerals and a stench of burned cloth that seemed to cling to the neighborhood. And then, as the city does, New York attempted to translate tragedy into order. It demanded answers. And it demanded someone to blame. Investigations were launched. Witnesses were gathered. The owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were called into the machinery of justice. This is the moment where many listeners expect catharsis. The courtroom, the guilty verdict, the punishment that matches the crime. It is the moment where we want the story to prove that society corrects itself, that the deaths of 146 people cannot simply be absorbed and forgotten. But the Triangle story is not a comfort story. It is, in part, a lesson in how money does not only buy comfort, it buys complexity. It buys doubt. It buys the ability to turn obvious facts into questions, and questions into escape routes. Harris and Blank were charged, among other things, with manslaughter. The locked doors, the trapped workers, the policy of control, these facts were not hidden. Survivors testified. Evidence was presented. The moral picture was clear. But moral clarity does not guarantee legal clarity, and legal clarity is often where powerful people place their shield. Their defense was a kind of cold, elegant maneuver. They argued that no one could prove the owners knew the door was locked at the exact time of the fire. The distinction is grotesque, like arguing that if you built a trap, you cannot be blamed if you weren't physically holding the trap's handle at the moment it closed. Yet the courtroom, bound by rules designed to be precise but easily manipulated, allowed that distinction to matter. And so, astonishingly, the verdict came acquittal. Not guilty. The city that had watched young women fall from the 9th floor now watched the men who profited from their labor walk away without criminal punishment. This is where the episode's message sharpens into something almost unbearable. When the value of a shirt is placed higher than the value of the person who sews it, even justice can be stitched with weak thread. But the cruelty did not end at acquittal. It continued in arithmetic. Families of the victims pursued civil suits, because civil court sometimes becomes the only place the powerless can extract a form of acknowledgement. Yet the settlement amounts that emerged were insultingly small. $75 per life. That is what many families received, an amount that, even in 1911 terms, felt like a bureaucratic shrug in the face of a child's death. And then the final twist, so cynical it feels like satire, except it is real. The owners received more from insurance than the families received from the courts. Insurance payouts were reportedly hundreds of dollars per victim, a sum large enough to transform tragedy into profit. It meant the deaths did not only fail to punish the owners, they could be financially advantageous. This is why your episode title, Ashes of Greed, is not poetic exaggeration. It is literal. The girls became ash, and the ash was converted into money. So where is the hope? Where is the meaning that doesn't insult the dead? It arrives not through the owners and not through the courtroom's narrow outcome, but through witnesses, people who saw what happened and refused to let it become just another headline that fades. One of those witnesses was a woman named Frances Perkins. Picture her not as a symbol, but as a person standing in the crowd, looking up, hearing the impacts, feeling helpless. Something about that day rooted itself in her mind with the stubbornness of a vow. She would later describe the fire as a turning point, an event that made it impossible to treat labor reform as an abstract political topic. Once you have seen bodies fall because a door was locked for profit, the argument becomes simple. Either you change the rules, or you accept that the city is willing to burn girls alive for fabric. From that point forward, the tragedy's energy began to transform into policy. Not quickly, not cleanly, but relentlessly. Investigations into factory conditions intensified. Fire safety codes became more serious. Requirements emerged and hardened. Clearer exit routes, doors that open outward, limits on locked exits, more adequate stairways, alarms, drills, and eventually the kinds of safety systems modern people take for granted: exit signs, sprinklers, inspections that are more than theater. Each rule was, in its own way, an attempt to prevent another Saturday afternoon from turning into a public execution. And the Triangle Fire became a reference point, an anchor whenever reformers demanded change. They didn't have to speak in hypotheticals. They could say, "Remember those girls? Remember the 9th floor? Remember the locked door? Remember that fireproof did not mean safe. Remember what greed sounds like when it hits the pavement." This is the episode's final, quiet power. It forces the listener to recognize that many of the protections we assume are normal were written under pressure, paid for by victims who never benefited from them. The modern workplace, its fire exits, its regulations, its insistence that you cannot lock people in did not appear because owners suddenly became kind. It appeared because the alternative became too public to ignore. So you end not with flames, but with aftermath. A building still standing, a city changed, and a moral contrast that cannot be softened. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is the moment New York learned that progress without dignity is just another form of brutality. It is the moment the city realized that the architecture of capitalism, locked doors, crowded floors, ignored warnings, can be as deadly as any natural disaster. And it is the moment that proved a final truth, as cold as ash. When a society treats human beings as replaceable, it will eventually replace them with grief.